Glad you're able to be here. We've missed some people lately from sickness and travels, and maybe we're finally starting to get everybody back. Still got some travelers out, but hopefully they'll have a safe return. We are looking at lesson 113 today. 113, which is still part 11 of this study of the life of Christ. We're coming up on the end of that part. If you want to open up to, Matthew 26, or Mark 14, or Luke 22, or John 18. 4 choices. Just give us a quick recap. Wednesday night we didn't quite get through the Jesus' arrest and betrayal, so maybe we'll recap what's been happening here, what just happened. Jesus goes to the garden with his apostles and apparently some other disciples. He takes Peter, James, and John to the farther in, it seems. He's praying. Finally, when his time of prayer is done, here comes a band of Jews and some Roman soldiers, and they're led by Judas Iscariot, who then gives the signal or the sign, kissing Jesus, greeting him with a kiss. And that was the time when they were to come in and seize the man that he was to kiss, which is when Peter decided to prove his devotion and to back up his claim, if you think about it, by drawing his sword and trying to defend Jesus. When they come in to arrest him and Peter perceives what's about to happen, he draws his sword. Jesus has to rebuke him, repairs the damage that he did as much as he could repair it. And it was at this point that the officers did lay hands on Jesus, arrested him, and that's when the disciples that were present, we don't know how many, they fled into the night. But at some point, as that band of men was leading Jesus back into the city, Peter and John turned back after their master, and we don't know at what point they caught up to him, but they would eventually. And now it was time for the Jewish trial, so-called trial. There was really no trial at all, not in the sense of the word, the actual sense of the word. But they've been trying to get rid of Jesus for quite some time now. So the purpose of this trial was to do that, which makes it not a trial at all, really. So really what they're doing is just taking due course to justify themselves, maybe vindicate themselves before the people, and maybe even within themselves. And that's what our lesson here is about this morning. The Jewish trials. Jewish trials and Peter's denials. Nice little rhyme there. Well, first, let's read what happened here. We'll look at John's account, and we'll read John 18 beginning in verse 12. So the band of soldiers and their captain and the officers of the Jews arrested Jesus and bound him. First they led him to Annas, for he was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, who was high priest that year. It was Caiaphas who had advised the Jews that it would be expedient that one man should die for the people. Verse 19, says the high priest then questioned Jesus about his disciples and his teaching. And then verse 24 says, Annas then sent him bound to Caiaphas, the high priest. So first, we're told Jesus is taken to a man named Annas. that leads to the question, naturally, who in the world is Annas? And we're told he was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, which leads to the question, who in the world is Caiaphas? Because that doesn't help us very much, does it? Who's Annas? He's Caiaphas' father-in-law. Well, who? Okay, who's he then? Who's this guy? Well, Caiaphas, we're told, was the actual high priest, the true, official high priest. Annas was the former high priest, who also happened to be the father-in-law of the current high priest. John says he was high priest that year. Kind of interesting wording there. May indicate a little bit of a change in the normal order of things. Well, Annas was, just to get us an idea of who this guy was, he was high priest from around the year AD 6 up until somewhere around the vicinity of 15. And the high priesthood was normally a lifelong office, but he was removed by the predecessor of Pilate, Pontius Pilate. His predecessor removed Annas from the priesthood, the high priesthood. And Alfred Edersheim says that there was no figure better known in contemporary Jewish history than Annas. He was seen as sort of a hero of sorts, it seems, among some of the Jews. Because while he only was high priest for a few years, that priesthood was filled by at least 5 of his own sons, his son-in-law, Caiaphas, and then by one of his grandsons. So he was a pretty heavy hitter in the Jewish circles and the Jewish tradition because of how big of a player he was in that whole game. And it really was kind of like a game, especially by a man like him. He was a man who enjoyed all the benefits of the office of high priest and the influence of that office without having the responsibility of the office or any of the restraints that were involved in that office. So while Caiaphas was the man who was officially high priest, and not just Caiaphas, but any of his Annas' sons or grandson, when they were in office, the man who was really running the shots was Annas. So this man he was a real sinister, he was a politician-like kind of guy. He knew how to play the game. He knew how to get people on his side. He knew how to make friends, and he made friends in a way that a lot of people make friends when they have the resources, with lots and lots of money. So when you got enough money, you can make friends with anybody as long as those anybodies are equally of low moral value and are willing to be bought. So that's how he was so powerful with the Romans, probably, is because he was rich. But he also didn't really have any special convictions. He wasn't an overly religious guy. He was just a man who was after the power in whatever way he could have it. And it sort of leads to the question, why did they take Jesus to him in the first place when he wasn't the high priest? Well, it may be for many of the reasons we just said, because he may have had a lot of influence and control over this whole situation. But as far as Caiaphas goes, we can't overlook what John says in John 18:14, that it was him, he was the one, according to John 18:14, who had advised the Jews that it would be expedient that one man should die for the people. Now this is a reference to John 11, verse 49 and 50. Here's what John records back in chapter 11. Actually, I'll just read verse 45, starting in verse 45. Many of the Jews, therefore, who had come with Mary and had seen what he did, believed in him. But some of them went to the Pharisees and told them what Jesus had done. So the chief priests and the Pharisees gathered the council and said, "What are we to do? For this man performs many signs. If we let him go on like this, everyone will believe in him, and the Romans will come and take away both our place and our nation." But one of them, Caiaphas, who was high priest that year, said to them, "You know nothing at all, nor do you understand that it is better for you that one man should die for the people, not that the whole nation should perish." So that was Caiaphas' idea, that it's the lesser of two evils that Jesus die instead of the whole nation being destroyed. Because in their eyes, if Jesus continued, the nation's going to be destroyed. Speaking of people who know nothing, he was right about that. What he wasn't right about is that he knew nothing either, except in a very mild or secondary prophetic sense, in which what he said had a little bit of truth in it. That it was better for the whole, not just Israel that he died, but it was better for the whole world that he die, because that was his whole purpose, that he died for the sins of the whole world. But that gives us an idea of who these two men were, beyond one of them being the high priest and one of them being his father-in-law. Annas was a very influential man, and he may have been brought to him first because his palace was closer, as far as we know. Or it may have been because he wanted him to be brought to him first. At any rate, he did. We know that Annas was just as hungry to get Jesus killed, but for more personal reasons, because he apparently made a killing off of the temple booths and the selling of things there. And Jesus, on 2 occasions already, really put a dent in that. And if Jesus' teaching had prevailed, that's going to really hurt Annas' pocketbook. And so he wanted Jesus to be killed as much as anybody, but he did it in a much more cunning and secretive way than his son-in-law did. So he's brought to Annas, and nothing really is recorded about what happened at Annas' palace. John's account is not exactly chronological, it seems, with putting it with the others. That's why we had verses 12 through 14 paired with verse 19 and verse 24, because it seems that everything that happened at Annas' palace went unrecorded, and that it was before Caiaphas that the questioning really began, the questioning that's recorded. So he's taken to Annas. We don't really know what all happened there, but after that he was taken to Caiaphas. Of course, some of what John records may have taken place before Annas, but it seems that it took place before Caiaphas. Now, when he gets to this point, we'll go back over to Matthew's account, Matthew 26, and here's what we read. Jesus, remember, he's all alone. Peter and John have now come back around, but fairly differently, as we'll see. Matthew 26, beginning in verse 57, says, "Then those who had seized Jesus led him to Caiaphas the high priest, where the scribes and the elders had gathered." By the way, John was the only one that even mentioned Annas seeing Jesus at all. That's why we were in John mainly. He's the only one that mentioned that first stage. "And Peter was following him at a distance as far as the courtyard of the high priest. And going inside, he sat with the guards to see the end. Now the chief priests and the whole council were seeking false testimony against Jesus, that they might put him to death. But they found none, though many false witnesses came forward. At last 2 came forward and said, 'This man said, I'm able to destroy the temple of God and rebuild it in 3 days.' And the high priest stood up and said, 'Have you no answer to make? What is it that these men testify against you?' But Jesus remained silent. And the high priest said to him, 'I adjure you by the living God, tell us if you are the Christ, the Son of God.' Jesus said to him, 'You have said so. But I tell you, from now on you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven.' Then the high priest tore his robes and said, 'He has uttered blasphemy. What further witnesses do we need? You've now heard his blasphemy. What is your judgment?' They answered, 'He deserves death.' Then they spit in his face and struck him, and some slapped him, saying, "Prophesy to us, you Christ. Who is it that struck you?" Okay. Here's their dilemma at this stage. They needed false testimony. They needed testimony against Jesus, but they had none. And they found none. They also were looking for false testimony at this point that would be enough to prosecute Jesus, but they didn't have any, and they still couldn't get any. So here's their dilemma, what to do. We need something against this man to be able to justly, or at least under the guise of justice, put him to death. But we don't have anything. What to do? What should we do? And then somebody came up with the idea, I got it. I got the perfect idea. We'll just make stuff up. It's so simple, isn't it? Whenever you have no morals, things are simple. We'll just make stuff up. A practice that has been going on for as long as time can remember and is still going on today. What can I do to convince people that I'm doing something that's good, or that they should vote for me, or whatever? I'll just lie over and over. We're seeing a lot of that in the last few weeks. Non-stop lies. Well, this is what they did at Jesus' trial. They made stuff up. At least they made some stuff up, and other things they didn't make up, but they twisted it. And that's what these two happened with these two that came forward. Said, I'll tell you something this man said. He said, I can destroy the temple of God and then rebuild it in 3 days. That was half true, wasn't it? First of all, Jesus didn't say temple of God. But if we take out that prepositional phrase, he said, I can rebuild this temple in 3 days. If you destroy it, I'll rebuild it in 3 days. He said that, didn't he? But was he talking about the temple of Herod at that time it was the temple of Herod where God dwelt? No. He was talking about his own body. This temple.
It's just like now, though, with commercials, they could edit, cut one sentence you say, plus it next to another sentence you said, and turn something you said into something completely different.
Yep. That's one of the most effective things to do, is take a statement out of context. And that's what they've done here with Jesus in this testimony. And they already challenged him. They said, it's taken 40 years to build this the way you see it now, or whatever, or maybe even more than 40, 50-something years. He says, you're going to build it in 3 days? But that's where the gospel writer says he wasn't talking about the temple. He was talking about his own body. And he was talking about how he would be raised 3 days after he was put into the grave, into the tomb. Yeah, he could have built the temple in 3 days, I suppose, if he wanted to. He built the whole planet and solar system that the temple was in, so I wouldn't think the temple would be much of a struggle for him. But still, that's not what he meant. He's talking about his body. So here's another instance of where a half-truth makes a full lie, and it's actually more dangerous than an outright lie, because Jesus did say that, and there will be people that heard him say that, and they would remember him saying that, and now that this twist has been put on it, then they may be convinced that that's what he meant when it's not. And yet, the high priest says, well, you don't have anything to say? Did you hear what these two men said? What say you? But Jesus remained silent. Of all the things that Jesus did during this time, that is one of the most remarkable to me, one of the most impressive. How could a man remain silent when somebody has just taken his words and twisted them for the purpose of prosecuting him for a crime that he didn't commit. How? How could that happen? If there was ever a time when somebody would speak up, that would have been the time. He could have stayed silent that whole time with all the intention in the world to remain silent. But when that happened, I at least would have started shooting the mouth off because I wouldn't be able to handle that. And I would have at least said, that's not what I meant. But Jesus didn't say anything. It's amazing. So then the high priest pretty much puts him on the spot with an oath. I adjure you by the living God. That's an oath. The strongest of any oath of any kind. Tell us if you are the Christ, the Son of God. And he, if I can paraphrase his answer in verse 64, he says, yes. I am. I am as you've just said. That's when the high priest tears his robe. What did he do that for? That was silly, wasn't it? Now he's going to have to go get that stitched up. It's another one of those things that there is a great divide between Western and Eastern culture. Because if somebody did that in our culture, it would make no sense, and we would just think this person is weird. This person's crazy. They're tearing their clothes. But that was a way that an outward expression of some sort of grief or horrible thing that's just happened. That, I can't even believe my ears. Tearing his robe, and they probably did it in such an over-exaggerated way. Not everybody, but they probably did, because we know what kind of men they were. And they said, we don't even need anything else. No further questions, Your Honor, because you've all heard it from his own mouth. So what do you decide? And they said, he ought to die. Now, we may think that's a little extreme, but if what he did actually was blaspheme, then that was, according to the law, what should happen. The problem was he wasn't blaspheming. He was just saying something that was true. But that's all they needed for this part. And the persecution then sort of ramped up quite a bit. We read they spit in his face, just like they do in our courtrooms today, right? Once a sentence is passed, then everybody gets to go up and spit in their face and hit them in the face. No, this is an absolute travesty. This is a mockery. This is never was a trial, and it is not made any better here. Although it may not have been too uncommon to do to actual criminals, as wrong or right as somebody might want to claim that is. They spit in his face, they hit him, and some of them even added the mockery on top of, hitting him in the face and then telling him to try to guess who hit him in the face. Of course, his vision would have to be impaired somehow. So then they say, tell us which one of us hit you? Prophesy. Can you guess? See, they're just insulting him, mocking him, because he claimed to be a prophet, and the people held him to be a prophet, so he ought to be able to say who hit him. Just sickening to think of, especially when these people know, at least some of them that are there know that this whole thing was a setup, and they're still acting like this. This is where the scene turns. The camera pans to somewhere else, and we return to Peter and John, based on John's account. We learn something interesting about John in his account at this point. Going back over to John 18, verse 15, we read, Simon Peter followed Jesus, and so did another disciple. That is presumably John, because that's how he always referred to himself anonymously. It says, since that disciple was known to the high priest, he entered with Jesus into the courtyard of the high priest, but Peter stood outside at the door. So the other disciple, who was known to the high priest, went out and spoke to the servant girl who kept watch at the door and brought Peter in. See, John, already we get the idea that he was sort of ahead of Peter, Some people think that Peter was actually the first to go back after Jesus. Got a 50-50 chance. It was either him or John. But at any rate, even if Peter did turn first, John went the farther, sort of the opposite later on after Jesus is raised, and they both run to the tomb, and Peter gets there first, but then John is the one that goes in. Or John goes in first, gets there first, and Peter goes in. Now, we see Peter, who had been hanging back, remember, he's following at a distance, whereas John seems to be following at less of a distance, at least. And he was known to the high priest. Isn't that interesting? I wonder how John was known to the high priest when Peter wasn't. And so much that he entered, notice, with Jesus, at least in a close enough proximity to Jesus that it could be called with Jesus, whereas Peter was hanging back and he stayed outside. But then John sort of noticed that Peter didn't come in. So he goes back out and he pretty much drags Peter in. Says, Peter, get in here. He talked to the servant girl who was keeping watch at the door. It kind of puts John in a little bit of a new light, at least, because really John doesn't enter the picture too much. I mean, maybe second place to Peter as far as how many parts he has in the gospel records. But he apparently had some sway of some kind, known to the high priest, so that he entered right in there. And then he goes and gets Peter, drags him in there. I'm sure he would be grateful for that later. But even when he comes into the courtyard, he still hangs back. He's hanging around the outskirts. He's trying to blend in. We read, let's see if I can see which account it is. We read that he was, nope, it's not that one. Maybe it's Luke. Warming himself by the fire. I'm 0 for 2 so far. Maybe I got 2 more shots. Oh, John 18:18, okay. One of the times where it says, the servants and officers had made a charcoal fire because it was cold. They were standing and warming themselves, and Peter was with them, standing and warming himself. So that's where Peter is. One of the other ones says it, I think, a little earlier than that point, before he's approached by anybody. We get this picture of him there hanging around the guards. Mark 14:66, Peter was below in the courtyard, and Peter's warming himself. He's clearly hanging back, trying to blend in a little bit. We don't know where John was after he got Peter in there. John apparently went back somewhere closer to where Jesus was. Peter's hanging back because he wants to see what's going to happen, but he doesn't want to rouse anybody's attention. How ironic is it then that that's exactly what ended up happening? A girl spotted him and recognized him as a disciple of Jesus. And she says, hey, you're one of his disciples, aren't you? I've seen you before. And he said, woman, I do not know him. I do not know him. He denied his knowledge of Jesus. How did he deny Jesus? He did not deny Jesus by saying, I do not believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God. Or I believe that Jesus is not the Christ, the Son of God. That's not how you deny Jesus. That's one way to deny Jesus. But Peter, how many times have we said? Peter denied Jesus 3 times. But what he denied was having any connection to Jesus. I don't know that man. You're saying that you've seen me with him before. I don't know him. You got the wrong guy. A little later, someone else saw him and said, you're one of them. You're one of those that's with this guy. You're one of his people. Peter said, I'm not. I'm not one of them. I'm not one of his disciples. About an hour passed by, Luke says, and another came up and said, this guy is definitely one of them. He's a Galilean. They apparently could tell he was Galilean just from his voice, I guess. Sometimes our voices give us away, you know. And he said, man, I don't know what you're talking about. John's account says, let's see. He denied it, said, I'm not. I guess that is the last one he mentions. One of them makes it clear that he went farther the third time. He was cursing, it says, or something of that nature. He was emphatically saying, I do not know this man. I'm not one of his disciples. I guess he would have to say, yes, I'm Galilean, but I'm not one of his disciples. I don't know the man. I've never seen the man before. And suddenly, in fact, Luke says immediately while he was still speaking, he was going on this time, trying to get them to see, I am not who you think I am. While he was still in the process of denying his connection to Jesus, a rooster crows. And that's where the goosebumps come in, if not before. And if not then, they will next. A rooster crows. And Luke's account is so powerful at this point because he includes a detail that the others don't. When that rooster crowed, Luke says, the Lord turned and looked at Peter. That's a very short sentence, a very small detail that the others don't even mention, and yet it really adds a lot to this whole scene. Because the implication is that Peter was also looking at him. The Lord turned. Remember, he's up there, center stage, being tried and mocked and all this other stuff. He's the bound prisoner. All eyes are on him, but Jesus turns. Even though Peter was at a distance, even though Peter's trying to blend in, Jesus knew where he was, and he turns and he looks at him, and they seem to make eye contact. And that is indicated by the fact that that's when Peter remembered what the Lord had said. How he had said to him, before the rooster crows today, you'll deny me 3 times. Remember, he said, all of you are going to fall away from me tonight. And Peter said, even if these guys fall away, I'll never fall away. I'll never run away from you. And he said, Peter, 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 before the rooster crows, you'll deny me 3 times. And I don't think it records that he said anything back to that part, but you know what he was thinking. He's like, no, I can't accept that because I know in my heart I would never do that. Now he did it. Isn't it interesting that it didn't occur to him after the first time that he said, I don't know him.
Because he's in the heat of the moment, like in a panic, it's a
Yeah.
situation. And how quick we are to say, I will never do something, or to think to ourselves, even if I was in...
It may be because of the heat of the moment. It may, even after the second time, whenever there was an out, we don't know how close the first 2 were. They seem to be pretty close. It says a little later. But then there was almost a whole hour that between the second and third time. Surely that would have been a time when it would have occurred to him. But it may be that he wasn't even considering what he did to be denying Jesus. Like, I'm not denying him. They put me on the spot, and I had to act, I mean, sure, think of all the ways we could justify something like that. Surely Jesus doesn't want me to get killed, He's got work for me to do, and so many different ways. But it wasn't until that rooster crowed, and then the Lord looked at him. Everything came back around. He came to his senses, and he remembered that just a few hours ago, he had said this was going to happen. And he denied it. And yet, look at what's happened. And it says that he went out of the courtyard there. He left the premises, and he burst into tears. The word that is used there is that one of the stronger words for weeping. It's not the silent, calm sort of shedding of tears, but an audible burst into tears. He broke down outside, bursts into tears because of what he's just done. And he's not able to approach Jesus, in that case. He could have, I guess, impulsively went up to Jesus and said, "I'm sorry." And nobody would have known what in the world he's talking about. But Jesus would have, and Peter would have. But he is so overcome with the emotion of what has just happened that he leaves and he breaks down, bursts into tears. John, still inside. Now Peter's outside. We don't know where he goes. We just know that he has now left the palace of the high priest Caiaphas, and he is now outside. Whether he just hung around outside or went further, we don't know. Now, the Sanhedrin is going to pass their more official sentence to the Romans. But now they have another dilemma. They've got their confession. They've got witnesses to the blasphemy. But they have a dilemma. The Jews, as of very recently, in fact, some have said it was like that same year when the Romans had taken away the Jews' right to pronounce capital punishment. But at least at some point recently, they were no longer allowed to pronounce death without the Romans, because they were just tributaries of the Romans at this point. So they have to present this to the Romans. But the other side of their dilemma was that Pilate is not going to care a thing about somebody who has allegedly blasphemed the God of the Jews. Why would Pilate care about that? You know what alleged blasphemy of the God of the Jews means to Pilate? That the person has done nothing. Completely innocent. He doesn't care about that. Certainly not worthy of death. So that puts them in a dilemma. How are we going to be able to convince the Roman governor to put this man to death? And so they very carefully calculated their accusations. In Luke 23, this is what they said. We found this man, number one, misleading our nation. Not so much behind that one unless they go further into in what way. Number two, forbidding us to pay Roman taxes. Absolute, utter lie. If they would have said he neglected to pay Roman taxes, there could have been at least a grain of truth in that, because at the one occasion he hadn't yet paid it. When people came to the door and they said, "Does your master pay the temple tax?" And Peter said, "Yes." But he hadn't paid it yet, apparently. But he did after that. But they said, "He's forbidding us to pay Roman taxes." And even when they put him directly to the question about Roman taxes, he said, "Yes, you should pay the tax. Give to Caesar what belongs to Caesar." So they totally invented this, just as some, sprinkling of little pixie dust on their little presentation. And, number 3, declaring that he is a king. So we have an irrelevant lie, a total lie that really would have caught their attention, and then another twisting of words that cast Jesus in a negative light. And that last one would have been the most important. Because what happens when somebody declares to be a king who is not the king? As a rule, what would happen, do you think? That would be the end of it? What's that? Okay, it'll be the end of him, but what first will happen? All right, there's going to be some people that'll say, yeah, I like him better than the real king, so he's my king. And then there'll be some more people that say, I'm with you. And then the more and more and more until the real king and the army has to step in and squash them like a bug, including killing the man who claimed to be a king most of all and most publicly of all. That's what they're trying to present Jesus as being, because there had been false messiahs in the past that did that very thing. I'm the Messiah, and now it's time for God's kingdom to be established, and we're going to beat up Rome because that's what the Messiah is supposed to do. So this was their accusation against him. It was utterly deceitful, but this was the only way that they were going to be able to get Pilate to even pay attention. It's almost like this case is important to us, but how can we get this before the Supreme Court? Because they probably won't think it's that as big of a deal, so this is how they did it. We found this man. It's not anything to do with us. We didn't want to have to do this, but we found this man doing these things, misleading our nation, forbidding us to pay Roman taxes, and declaring that he's a king. So I don't know how serious these things are, but what do you think should be done? You know, this is how they're going to take it to him. Just the whole thing is just laced with deceit and cunning and evil, frankly. Because remember, the thing they're trying to accomplish is to get him killed. So they're going to do whatever it takes. We'll ask God to forgive us later if we sin in the process. But we have to do whatever it takes to get this man put to death. All right. Any other thoughts or comments? So much for the Jewish so-called trial of Jesus. Can't help but be moved by Peter's recognition of his sin in that moment, though, because it should be a reminder for us in the day of judgment. As Jesus looked at him, he realized it all came flooding back. Recognized the sign of Jesus, that rooster. He recognized or looked into the eyes of Jesus. He remembered the words of Jesus, and then he recognized his sin against Jesus. And on Judgment Day, we're all going to recognize the sign of Jesus when that trumpet sounds and the shout of the archangel. We're going to look into the eyes of Jesus, and we're going to remember the words of Jesus, and then we're going to remember every deed that we did while we were living on the earth. And so what's still unclear to us is our reaction. We don't have to run away, weeping like Peter did, but we can enter into the home that He's prepared for us if we will repent of our sins and follow Him, preparing for that day. That can be a good meeting instead of a terrifying one. Choice is ours. Thank you again for your comments and attention.